Well, hello people, and welcome back to chapter 3 of this interesting book called The British Israelites, or Evidence of Our Hebrew Origins. Chapter 3 is Philological Evidence, and this is philology. It's the branch of knowledge that deals with the structure, historical development, and relationships of a language or languages. So we'll be looking at the philology of why Britain is a holy land. Right, let's get down to it. Chapter 3, Philological Evidence. Dr. Latham, in his English language, page 1, says, "The first point to be remembered in the history of the English language is the fact that the present English was not the original language of either the British Islands altogether or any portion of them. Indeed, of the whole of Great Britain, it is not the language at the present moment. Welsh is spoken in Wales, Manx in the Isle of Man, Scotch Gaelic in the Highlands of Scotland, and Irish Gaelic in Ireland. The English that is now spoken was once as foreign to our country as it is at present to the East Indies, and it was no more our primitive vernacular tongue than it is the primitive vernacular tongue of North America or Australia. As early as the year 1676 AD, an opinion was advanced by Ayelet Sams in a work entitled Britannia Antiqua Illustrata that the first colonizers of Ireland were the merchants of Tyre and Sidon. In confirmation of this opinion, the existence of several Eastern customs in Ireland was adduced by subsequent antiquarians. Further, marks of an Eastern origin of the Irish were found in the Gaelic dialect of that country. Finally, the matter, in the eyes at least of the national writers, was satisfactorily settled by the famous discovery attributed to General Valency of the true meaning of the Carthaginian lines in Plautus. In the little Carthaginian Ponulus of the Latin comic writer Plautus, a portion of the dialogue is carried on in the language of Carthage. That the Punic language of Carthage should closely resemble that of the mother city Tyre, which was Phoenician, and that the Phoenician of Tyre should be allied to the language of Palestine and Syria, was soon remarked by the classical commentators of the time. Joseph Scaliger asserted that the Punic of the Ponulus differed but little from pure Hebrew, ab Hebrezimi puratit param abesi. Hebrew is the foundation of English. The two first lines of a speech in Act 5 stands thus: Nayath alonam valonath sekorath jizmakon nith chai mlakai jithmu mitzlia metibaram ishi. The same in Hebrew characters. So here, guys, this is the Hebrew characters for it. Bocart's Latin version: Dios diasc veneror qui hanc urbum collant ut quod de mea rea huc vene right venerum. English translation: I ask the gods and goddesses that preside over this city that my plans may be fulfilled. May my business prosper under their guidance. To those writers who deny the affinity between the Irish and Welsh can identify the Erse Irish with the Hebrew, I apply the term nyctalopia, the power of seeing best in the dark, applied by a writer in one of the periodicals to similar etymologists. Latham's English Language, 2nd edition, page 110. William Tyndale the Martin, or Tyndale. Tyndale was a learned Hebrew scholar and the first to publish a printed translation of the Bible in English. He says, "The Greek tongue agreeth more with the English than the Latin, and the properties of the Hebrew tongue agrees 1,000 times more with the English than with the Latin." The Reverend Canon Lyson, ignoring the fact that the British or Israelites, says in page 523 of his British Ancestors, Roland deduces in his Mona Antiqua Restaurata as many as 300 British roots from the Hebrew, but I suspect that a vast number more words now in use may be traced to that language, and if both the Gothic and the Celtic are cognates of Hebrew, then it is the basis of the language we now speak, being the root both of the British and the Anglo-Saxon. In page 479 he says, his object is to show that the whole foundation of the English language as we now use it is Hebrew or Chaldee, and when we use it in the sense in which it is applied by Vertringa, who says of all languages the Chaldee differs the least from the Hebrew, so that it is rather to be esteemed a dialect or varied pronunciation than a different language. In page 233 he adds that the Sakhoi and the Cymry had much in common in the construction of the language and religion. And in page 359 he says the most remarkable concurrence of the Hebrew and English words is found in words of daily and domestic use, showing more than any other fact that the source from which our language was drawn. We find especially a common tie in the Celtic and the Hebrew languages, namely that of the excess of consonants over vowels and the system of literal mutation, which is the marked feature of both. Yet, this we gather from the names attaching to the British monuments still remaining among us. When divested of modern corruptions, that there is a strong affinity between these British names and that language of which Hebrew is either the original or one of its earliest offshoots, and that, therefore, Hebrew, Chaldee, or some other very near cognate must have been the language of the first inhabitants of this island. Our British Ancestors, page 93. The same author in Appendix 6, or is that 4, gives a glossary of upwards of 4,000 English words, which apparently, judging by the sound and sense, are derived from the Hebrew, Chaldee, or Syriac. Professor John Earle of Oxford, in his Anglo-Saxon Literature, published by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, page 120, says, the rhetorical character of Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is most prominent, is a certain repetition of epithet or phrase in a manner which distinctly resembles the parallelism of Hebrew poetry. A paper was read at the last Congress of the British Archaeological Association by the Reverend Dr. Margulouth, Vicar, editor of the Hebrew Christian Witness, Bishop Merriman in the chair. The learned doctor says in his paper, at last year's Congress I adduced examples of whole sentences of positive archaic Hebraisms in the now obsolete Cornish language. Again, he says, I now confine myself to the time-honoured appellation of Cymry. It is no more true-born English than is the term Gael or Welsh. The nomenclature of both owe their true birth to a parentage and a country far more ancient than the British or the English. Those two terms, Gael, which became Wale, and then Welsh and Cymry, by which the Greeks became Cymroi, amongst the Teutons, Cimbri, and Latinized into Cambria, are purely Hebrew origin. Reverend N. Poole's 50 Reasons, page 42. Reverend Jacob Tomlin, M.A., in his 48 languages analysed and compared, says the early literature of Britain was largely in the Hebrew, with several modifications, and that 1/4 part of the word of the Saxon tongue bear a close affinity with the Hebrew. Taliesin, the Prince of Druid Bards, said, Trothator Fingofeg, Win Ephrai Yin Ephrog, which translates means my lore has been declared in Hebrew and Hebraic. Davies, Mythology and Rites of the British Druids, Appendix 13 or whatever that is, page 572. The fact is that the English language is idiomatically Hebraic, though many of the words now used are Teutonic, Aryan. In other words, we think in Hebrew but express our thoughts in Latin and Greek. To understand what we mean, take a sentence in Latin or Greek and translate it into English. What a transposition of words, disarrangement of phrases have to take place before any sense can be made to an English mind. Not so in Hebrew. Take, for example, a passage from Caesar's Gallic War, translated literally. The kind this is out of chariots of a battle, firstly through all parts they drive round, and darts they throw, and by itself, by the fright of the horses, and by the noise of the wheels, the ranks generally they greatly disturb, and when themselves among of the cavalry, the squadrons, they insinuated out of the chariots, they leap down, and by the feet they fight. So this sounds a bit broken up here. The drivers, in the meantime, a little out of the battle, they retire, and so the chariots they collect, that if the host of the enemy are pressed quick to their men, a reception they may have. Thus the mobility of the cavalry, the stability of the foot soldiers in battles they stand before, and so much by the use daily and by the exercise they effect, so that in a sloping and precipitous place the rapidly moving horses to check, and in a little time to govern and to bend through the pole, to run and to on the yoke to stand upon, and themselves thence in the chariots very quickly to take back they may have been accustomed. So that was a literally, this is freely. This is a manner of fighting from chariots. Firstly, they drive round over all parts and cast their darts, and by the very fright of their horses and noise of the wheels generally greatly disturb the ranks. And when they have penetrated themselves among the squadrons of the cavalry, they leap down from their chariots and fight on foot. The drivers in the meantime retire from the battle, and so station the chariots that if they are pressed by a number of the enemy, they may have a quick retreat to their own men. Thus they display the quick movements of cavalry and the firmness of infantry in battles, and by daily practice and exercise effect so much that they are accustomed on sloping and steep ground to check their horses at full gallop, and to govern and turn them in a run along the pole and stand on the yoke, and from thence very quickly to return into the chariots. So the one on the right, the freely one, was a lot easier to read and made a lot more sense than the literal version. Philo Israel tells us that if we take the first chapter of Genesis and read the Hebrew words in the original, we find they are almost in exact order as translated in the English Bible. We considered his statement and example to be so important that we determined to test for ourselves the truth of what he said by a further examination. We accordingly obtained a copy of the interlineary Hebrew and English Psalter, published by Messrs. Baxter and Sons, from which we make the following extract, which is an ad verbatim translation of the original of Psalm. Jehovah is my shepherd, naught I shall want. In pastures of tender herb he will lay me down. By the waters of rest he will guide me. My soul he will restore. He will lead me in the tracks of righteousness because of his name. Moreover, when I shall walk in the valley of the shadow of death, not I will fear evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they will comfort me. Thou wilt sit in order before me, a table in the presence of my oppressors. Thou hast made fat with oil my head, my cup is overflowing. Surely goodness and mercy will pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of Jehovah to length of days. His Lordship, Lord Bray, by telling us how many accidents happened in combination in the two languages, Hebrew and English, to show their identity, completely refutes the idea of the separate origin of the two tongues. The relative pronouns, he tells us, are frequently suppressed in both Hebrew and English. The future and the present tenses are fused in both. The nouns are declined in neither. His Lordship points out that these identities between the two languages, declaring also they are part of a system of foreign to Latin and Greek. The fact is, the idiomatic texture and the dialectic structure of the English and Hebrewic languages are very similar, for the former is built on the latter, and one of the greatest miracles of the age is that the Hebrews, when they forgot everything else, never forgot their Hebrew idiom. So some of the New Testament writers, being uneducated fishermen, wrote as authors in Greek, but expressed themselves in Hebrew or Aramaic idiom, and, wonderful to relate, their Hebrew Greek reads off today in good modern English, when for each Greek word is substituted the English translation of the same. Such was not the case when the highly educated St. Paul wrote Greek. His Greek will not run with our modern English. St. John's, St. Matthew's and St. Mark's Greek does not run. Thus John, literally translated in the order of the Greek words, runs thus: In the beginning was the Logos, word, and the Logos was with God, and God was with the Logos. He was in the beginning with God. All things by him consisted, and without him there was made nothing that was made. In him life was, and the life was the light of men. Here the Hebrew idiom of St. John, writing in Greek, appears good English idiom, and can be read off in the very order of St. John's word translated. Not so St. Paul. His educated Greek was written in Greek, not Hebrew idiom, and will not, therefore, run when treated as above. Taken at haphazard proves this. Translated word for word, the passage runs thus, and is not good English. Now to Abraham there were spoken the promises, and to the seed of him. Not, says he, and to the seeds as to the many, but as to one, and to the seed of thee, which is Christos. For this I say, the covenant, the one that was confirmed of God in Christ, that after years 430 made law, may not disannul for the cancelling of the promise. This is nearly unintelligible because the idiom of St. Paul was Greek and not Hebrew English, like St. John's, Banner of Israel, November the 7th, 1883. No other language, we are informed, answers in idiomatic construction to the Hebrew but English. Babu English is a result of thinking in Hindustani and speaking in English. Pidgin English is Chinese thought expressed in English. In Barber's Suggestion on the Ancient Britons, 1854, chapter 5, page 60, the following interesting passage occurs. Cases of direct and open evidence as to the fact of the Semitic languages of the ancient Britons are very scarce. They were not scribes. In the god Lud, however, occurs a passage which has been generally given up as unintelligible to the Welsh, and from the translations, when attempted as of Welsh, it scarcely appears why they should have preserved. What, by the introductory verse out of the sacred poems they cry aloud, was an antique in the 5th century. Or anant oneant, rise woe to ye and woe to ye. O brith ye brithoi, Britain, Britain, alas. New o is nude, thou'rt wanderer of wanderings, birth ye Britain high. Britons, Britons, alas. Sight Eddie Uroi, wake, know yourself naked, misery and nakedness. In page 61 an expression occurs referring to these Britons. Goam Jehovah, the very Hebrew words of Scripture referring to the Israelites, the people of Jehovah. In the mythology of the British Druids, the being they worshipped is called Adonai, the Hebrew name for the Lord Almighty. Geoffrey Higgins, see Celtic Druids, page 63, gives complete phrases which are as good Welsh as they are Hebrew. The following two are specimens. Hebrew, Bayang Adonai eth kal neth jangob. Welsh, Byring Adon Id Hol Neud Jago. English, the Lord has swallowed up all the tabernacles of Jacob. So you can see here, people, the Hebrew and the Welsh are more similar than the English. See Bayurang, and there's Bayrang, and Adonai eth, Adon yith, Kal neth, Hol Newth, Jago, Jacob. See, this is Psalms. So Hebrew, Magenai Ingal Elioim. Welsh, Magenai Hil Elio. English, my shield is from God, or the protection is from the intelligences. So the same again, you can see the Hebrew and the Welsh are a lot more similar than the English. One of the Celtic lamentations given by Dr. Eadie in his Biblical Cyclopedia runs as follows. O son of Connell, why didst thou die? Royal, noble, learned, valiant, warlike, and eloquent, why didst thou die? Alas, alas, he who sprang from nobles of the race of Heber, why didst thou die? Origin, Destiny of Britain, by H. Britton, page 25. The above testimony shows the close connection that exists between Hebrew and Welsh, and the reference to Heber, the ancestor of the Hebrews, after whom they were called, confirms the testimony already quoted from the Taliesin, the Druid bard. In connection with the above ancient Hebrew poetry in Wales, read Hosea, My God will cast them, Ephraim, away because they did not hearken to me, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. The Hebrew word in the following passages translated covenant of the people is lebritham, to britham, Isa. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine land, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to Birtham, for light of the Gentiles. Isa. In an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people. To Birtham, i.e. to Britain, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. Thus we understand that Christ is given to the British Israel, the covenant people, for the purpose of showing forth Christ, the light of the world, to the Gentiles. It is for this we scattered throughout the heathen world. Oh, that we individually could realise this our divine mission and show forth Christ by a life consistent with our high and holy calling. Wow, that was a good chapter, I've got to say. That's one of the biggest things one of the biggest evidences that eases you towards Britain being a Hebrew country is the language, the philology. Anyway, people, thanks for hanging in there, and I will see you in the next chapter. Have a great weekend.